Thanks to both of you, of course, for your enthusiasm, and I think the most important thing you bring is your love for the text. You're showing us that that text is the heart of what we're about. What better way to begin these two erudite expositors than with a limerick?
With the what? Oh, limerick.
As you know, we're in the habit in this country of giving sports figures names like A-Rod, and so I've taken the liberty of addressing this to T-Fret and Wally the Bee. When T-Fret debates Wally the Bee, the issue is God's sovereignty. Creation's location is seen in relation and not in J-E-D-O. You have both been practitioners of J-E-D-P. You're both interested in God's sovereignty.
Some more than others.
Some more than others. Well, maybe that's the place to begin. What have you to say?
Sovereignty, you've heard of that?
I have heard of that.
Why?
Well, I think you cannot have a theology of grace unless grace is sovereign. So Rob Bell got defrocked, didn't he, for saying love wins. I think love wins must be a statement about grace, but it's also a statement about sovereignty.
When you use the word sovereignty, what do you, I mean, give a definition for it, or give an illustration of what you mean by that word.
Well, I think the gift of manna in the wilderness was an act of governance over the wilderness. Governance is the performance of sovereignty. Is that all right?
Well, I don't know, is it? Let's.
It was a trick question.
Why, in connection with God's provision of manna to a starving people in the wilderness, would you make the move to God's sovereignty? Why not some other dimension of God's work in the world?
Well, I'm not opposed to other dimensions, but I think the appeal to other dimensions doesn't eliminate Israel's sense that God has a kind of authority that will outflank Pharaoh or outflank the wilderness or outflank. What's the problem with that?
Well, the problem, I think the problem is not sovereignty per se, but say the use of that language in a context where God comes to this people and provides for them in a moment of desperation. Wouldn't you want to appeal to some other dimension of God's work in the world than just, hey, you got this king here who's divvying out goodies.
Well, but this sovereignty is characterized by fidelity, by generosity, by compassion.
Okay, so the definition of sovereignty then comes into play here in a hurry. You're working with...
Well, I didn't bring it up, but
okay.
Yes, it does.
It doesn't take long to read your work and bring it up.
That's correct. That's right. Well, it seems to me that Israel finds that God is a more reliable source of life than any alternative. And I think the language of father, king, judge, ruler is the vocabulary through which Israel speaks about that. And those are all categories of sovereignty, I think.
If you use that as a primary metaphor in which to think about God, does that not have sharp implications for the behaviors of those of us who are created in the image of God and who live and work with this God in the world, if you will? We should, important thing, Walter, is be a king out there.
Have dominion.
Yeah.
Well, it's your text, but then it's, I think that in, you know better than I, but I think in the creation narrative, the earthlings are charged with governance and administration of the earth. Would that be true?
Well, in part, yes. I
Good.
think, yeah. But the language, it's interesting that the metaphor of king for God is relatively infrequent in Old Testament. I can find only 2 references in the whole Pentateuch, for example, to God as a king. But if you draw the language of sovereignty into the center of things, you're moving toward God as king, and that has all sorts of repercussions for how you are to follow this God. I will be a king as God is a king.
Well, but I think God's sovereignty is characterized by those 5 terms I cited: Chesed, Emeth, Racham, Mishpat, Tzedakah, in which God's reliability is reliable.
Yeah, we wouldn't want to give up on reliability, but do we have to zero in and lift up as for special attention the image of God as a king in order to get there?
No.
So why do you go there?
I don't always go there. I go there sometimes, as the text goes there sometimes.
Okay. I just wonder whether the image of God as a sovereign is helpful as we think about our role, our being image of God in the life of the world.
Yeah.
Whether the kingly images ruling over others.
Would you relate that sovereignty to the divine council and the authorization of prophetic speech from the divine council, which is royal imagery?
I mean, it's not that the royal imagery is absent.
Oh, that's good.
It's not that it's absent. I just wonder about its prominence.
Well, I take your point. I guess I need to look at my stuff. I would not have, if you'd asked me, I would not have thought that my accent on sovereignty was as accented as you find it to be.
Well, it depends upon what I'm reading.
Well, yeah.
Can I come to another question that was raised for me in your presentation this morning? Your use of the language of judgment, and God as the subject of judgment. I think that's important. It's very important. I'm struck, at least in my experience, with regard to the hesitation that so many church speakers, leaders have in using the language of judgment. I think commonly because judgment carries with it some exercise of violence. Mm-hmm. And I want to use judgment. I want to talk about that. How can you work with the language of judgment in such a way that you can steer clear of violence, or is violence an inevitable dimension of God's work in the world?
Well, it seems to be in the text, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, I tried to, you noticed that this morning, I tried to soft pedal agency in judgment. And I was moving in the direction of deeds and consequences, as in the woe oracles.
Yeah, yeah.
So I incline to think that the prophetic judgment is an indictment for choices that carry with them the seeds of death, because they are choices in God's creation that is ordered so that there are non-transgressible limits.
Act consequence, understand?
Yeah. And whether deathliness is inherently a word of violence, it could just be a word of abandonment or alienation. But it certainly is the language of negativity, whether it's violent negativity or some other negativity.
Would you agree with something like this? Help me with words, language. Violence will inevitably be associated with God, because those of us who follow this God are inevitably violent in one way or another. And so violence, because of who we are as agents, divine agents, because of who we are, violence will be associated with this God.
I think that's probably right. I don't know whether it's inevitable, but it seems to me that we at least need to be honest about the text, that it is so. And this whole surge of books that we're getting on God of violence, they all want to explain it away. And there are dozens of strategies for arguing that it's not there. And I don't think that's helpful. So I don't know whether it's inevitable, but it is inescapable in the text. And I suppose you're saying it's inescapable in our common life.
Yeah, given who we are.
Yeah,
Since
that's
we're
right.
human creatures, violence is going to be associated with the work we do on
right.
behalf of God.
Yeah.
So God, that's going to reflect back on who this God is and what this God is about, and violence will be associated somehow.
See, I think the thing that you and I walk around, we agree that God is for us. That's okay. What interests me, that I'd be interested to know what you think, is that the Bible, the Old Testament, sometimes wants to say God is for God. And it's best that when God is for God and God is for us converge, but they don't always converge. So in Exodus 14, the text has God say twice, I will get glory over Pharaoh. And now that eventuates in the emancipation of Israel, but the point is not the emancipation of Israel, the point is the enhancement of Yahweh.
So God is concerned especially about his reputation or something like that.
Yeah.
Isn't that, for God to be especially concerned about God's self, a little, selfish on God's part or something? Concerned about,
except that he's God.
Concerned about his own reputation in the world, maybe?
Yeah. But every time we sing a hymn, we imagine it must be pleasing to God. We magnify God by praise. This is a strange idea, to make God bigger.
The language of self, I think you use it someplace in your theology, that divine self-regard.
Yeah. What do you make of that?
I'm not very fond of that.
I thought that. Yeah.
And there's the kind of what it draws my mind to, language that we use for human behavior is selfishness.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, you don't see an issue with that.
Sure. But there it is in the text. And in Psalm 22, enthroned on the praises of Israel, which I take it to mean that if Israel stops singing, the throne sinks.
Well, boy, we have a lot of responsibility
We
there
do.
to keep God up
We
on
do.
the throne.
We do. We do. And I don't find that easy. So I struggle with it too.
Yeah.
But I think it's there. So in Isaiah 37, is it that God will not be mocked? It's very strange.
Retributive justice. Where does retributive justice fit in with that?
Well, I read Koch about that.
And you like it?
Yeah.
Carry out.
I think the covenantal prophetic tradition does want to say that our deeds come back on us. But as you know, the hard thing in the church is not retributive justice. The hard thing in the church is distributive justice.
And by that you mean?
That the wealth and the resources must be distributed for the common good of all.
And if that does not happen, then
We'll go down.
it comes back down.
Yeah. Which I think it's not a hard case to make, but that's what's happening to us.
Okay. And in connection with Old Testament judgment, justice themes, this is primarily due to a creational matter, that God created the world in such a way that deeds have consequences, often negative consequences,
Yeah.
and God is going to be associated with that, with the associated violence, simply because God created the world that way.
That's right. Or if you do it with the covenantal tradition of Deuteronomy, then it's the covenant curses, but it's the same thing. The extent to which God is an active agent, but either way, it's set up that way.
Yeah, the agency is an issue that we.
It is, isn't it?
So,
but you rhetorically, you can't get around the rhetoric of agency, whatever one makes of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Is God's agency inevitably mediated in and through that which is not God?
That's a trick question.
No, it's also a good one.
It is.
Okay.
No, I think I don't think it's always mediated. But you understand, let me say, my reservations about this is not with you. My reservation is with the theological progressives with whom I live in the United Church of Christ, who just explain everything away and have eliminated the reality of God in the life of the world. So that's really what I care about. And the liberal cliche is God has no hands but our hands. I don't believe that. But if you say then, well, God has hands, you're back at it.
Do you think that God ever acts in the world in an unmediated way.
I think the text says that God acts.
For example, give me a text. I'm sorry, that wasn't fair. I mean,
No, that's fair enough. I don't happen to have things at my fingertip. Well, I really think the Exodus has some direct agency. I understand what Moses and Aaron are said to have done, and maybe you think that's mediation.
wouldn't it? Why wouldn't it be?
Well, I don't think their mediation can account for what happened.
Well, I'm not suggesting that they worked alone,
Yeah.
but God chooses to work in and through that which is not God, to carry out God's work in the world, from words to people's words and deeds.
Yeah. Well, I don't have any problem with that. Would you say the same thing about manna?
But
That
manna?
manna, that it depended on Moses' nagging?
Well, nagging is that's a pretty good word for Moses, actually. Yes, it is. You got this relationship between Moses and God, and it is genuinely interactive.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
a lot of what
So
God
what do
does-
you? How do you think? If you think of, I cited Psalm 146 last night. God frees the prisoners, and God cares for the widow and the orphan. Do you think, in the use of that doxological rhetoric, that in a liturgical moment, Israel was imagining unmediated divine agency? So might one imagine that liturgically, but then when you got down to really think about it, you'd have to say it differently?
Well, maybe people shouldn't think that way in liturgy, that somehow God is acting in an unmediated way.
But that's how the rhetoric of the psalm lines it out.
There are many cases in the Old Testament. We probably have to go down verse by verse on these, but there are many cases in the Old Testament where God is the only subject of a sentence with regard to activity.
Right.
But then you read a few verses on, Moses and Aaron say...
Yeah, but not in 146.
Well, aren't we guided in our interpretation of such Psalms as Psalm 146, which uses only God as the subject, by other chapters, which say God works in and through that which is not God to accomplish God's work. Just because in a given context God is the only subject, that doesn't mean that God is the only subject. I mean, it's the language they use, it's the rhetoric.
And the question is, if it's the language they used, what did they mean by using the language they used?
Or at times it's only the mediator who's involved.
That's right.
And so
That's right.
Where's God in all this?
Yeah.
Well, God's, there's a basic conviction that.
Well, it's obviously it's an interpretive question that allows more than one reading. You'd agree to that? That is, when you want to say a Psalm 146 has to be read in light of these other narratives. That doesn't necessarily follow.
Well, necessarily follow. In other words,
I mean, you don't have to do that.
No, yeah. Well, the text itself doesn't do that. The text itself only uses God as a subject for that particular context.
Right.
But in reflecting upon that text, where God is the only subject, one would soon get caught up in the reality that God works in and through that which is not God and carrying out God's work in the world. So don't you need to have this larger context in which one thinks about God as only subject of some of these?
Well, and you know this, I am much more inclined to try to dwell in a text rather than what I think might be a more canonical way. Yeah, and I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
But dwelling in a text, so certainly you have to take into account and in a serious way the larger context in which those texts are found. I mean, you're not going to disagree with that, are you?
Well, I'm inclined procedurally on any given occasion to dwell in this text and see what you get from this text.
Okay.
That may not be methodologically very good.
No, I mean, clearly it's borne much fruit in your work. So-
Yeah, but I don't know what kind of fruit it is that you're yeah, it's what I wonder about in terms of something like 146. If you do that psalm liturgically, without those qualifiers, just liturgically, what is it that we're doing, and what is the effect of the doing of it in the life of the congregation? And I think that liturgically, to intrude the thought of mediation is a weakening of the power of the text liturgically. So, you know,
Why is that a weakening? Can you help me? Because if you get all God without mediation, you got sort of more God on your hands, or a bigger God, or
well, it is a sense that my life and our life in this moment of singing rests in the unutterable reality of God. Don't qualify it. Let it be. Now, in the seminar after the liturgy, that's okay. But I don't know, but I just wonder about that.
so that to talk about God in worship will take a different track, different form, different emphasis.
Yeah, I think so. A perfect example of that is in 1 Kings 8, where they dedicate the temple and God is in the temple. And then they have this seminar later on, and the exegetes say, you don't think God can be just in this little house, do you? So there's two claims. So yeah, I think we do things in liturgy that are changed in critical reflection upon the liturgy.
So the more theologically inclined I am, or more drawn to that sort of reflection, the more it intrudes on what the liturgical practices actually tries to do.
I think that's right.
There's some tension there, I think.
There is very important tension, but that's the tension that people like us practice all the time. We do something different in our guild work than we do in our liturgic performance.
One of the things that commonly is suggested for your work and mine is that the faith we have and the denominational theology or whatever that we have intrudes upon our exegetical work
Right.
in negative
I
ways.
I know that
And
very
so
well.
We're,
Right.
right, we're
You
seeing
can't spend time in Cambridge, England without knowing that.
we're seeing things that aren't really in that text.
Yeah.
We're trying to
Yeah.
promote our own theological perspective.
Right.
And how do you get out from underneath that sort of charge? You just live with it?
Yeah, I think so. It took me a long time to arrive at that. I kept thinking I needed to justify it or I need to conceal it. But then I came to the awareness that objective scholars are not objective either.
Right. Yeah,
Because most of the objective scholars are fighting their childhood fundamentalism or whatever.
Well, wow, that's quite a charge.
Well, it is. It's a long time reflected upon charge.
Okay. Childhood fundamentalism, okay.
I really think that. I think if you look at the radical people who are trying to explain away the claims of the gospel, I think that's where they come from.
And
So very many people, not everybody, but very many people.
So thereby they're rejecting the heritage.
Right, are trying to get free of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But, you know, I think, I do think that in our lifetime, critical work, largely because of Reverend Childs, critical work has changed and makes much more allowance for the fact that we do our work in a faith community, and that's much more legitimate than it was when we started, I think.
It's interesting, you can take a look at the indices of books and which authors are cited, you know, and you get a major topic, and at times your name doesn't even appear in the indices.
I know, I always check that.
And so
That's it.
It's living with that.
That's right, that awareness. Well, we've all spent time in Cambridge, and the erudite Old Testament people in Cambridge never thought I was doing scholarship.
Right. Yeah.
So
Until you pack St. John's with your lectures.
that
was then they understood.
Yeah, right. Well.
Remember
Yeah.
those lectures, don't you?
Pardon me?
You remember those lectures?
I do indeed. I do. Yep. On.
As the pendulum shifts between before the text and behind the text, there's always a moment where I like it to be on the text. I'm hearing Walt say the same thing. Where is that pendulum now, and which way is it going? Are we going
In the discipline?
In the discipline, yeah. Or your own works, but I'm interested in your read on the discipline right now.
Yeah, I don't know if it's changed much over the year. I think Brevard Childs was a significant voice that enabled us to read the text more theologically and still claim honesty with respect to the text.
Yep.
I guess Walter Brueggemann is one who would stand in that tradition, and your continuing work informs us with regard to the importance of that constant attention to the work of this text in ways that are more than objective.
And that's James Meilenberg already in some ways, yeah. So I think there's much less energy for behind the text now. I mean, there's still people working on that, and it's important work, but there's much less energy. Because you remember when we started going to SBL, we had movie night every year in which we all gathered to review the gains of archaeology in the last year, and all these slides. And now the archaeology people meet in a closet.
But the theological oriented folks, those sessions are still not major sessions.
No, that's true. That's right. Yep. Right.
I mean, I live and die, I guess you could say, with a comment by Walt Brentorff. When you're talking about biblical theology, you're not simply talking about a theology that you as a reader bring to the text. You're talking about the authors as theologians.
That's right.
There is a theology that
That's
is
right.
deeply informs the text
Yeah,
itself.
yeah.
It's not simply something I bring
Yep.
into the work
Yep.
with the text.
I have an impression about Reverend Child's work that he obviously was a giant, and he was paying attention to what the other giants were doing, and he didn't pay attention about what people like us do in theological seminaries. Because I think teaching in theological seminaries, we were never trapped in that pure kind of critical enterprise that he wanted to get over. I think without having names for it, we were always more nearly doing something like canonical or theological or something like that, just because of the context in which we worked, I think.
And you've got to work with those other colleagues, who are systematicians,
I know.
and pastoral theologians, and
That's right. God help them.
Those voices keep coming into the. Well, whatever. Yeah, that's fine.
We'll open it up for some questions. We have the 2 mics. Please keep your questions concise.
Mm-hmm.
I am troubled by Jewish and Christian Zionism. I want to hear how you place the promise of God to Abraham that his people would own this land eternally in the context of the present political situation.
Brad, say just a little bit more about the Zionism of which you're speaking.
I'm troubled by the Old Testament, which seems to approve of ethnic cleansing. And I'm troubled by the way in which that theme can be used today by Israeli settlers on the West Bank to say, you Canaanites, out of here, because God has given us this land, and that trumps all ethical considerations. Is that enough?
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think 2 things. One is, I think that in the text itself, that kind of Zionism is indeed critiqued. So that's important. The second thing I think that for me is much more important is that you cannot take an ancient text and simplistically transport it to a modern nation state. Just as I think with almost any issue that I can think of, you cannot take a specific ethical teaching of the Old Testament and simplistically transport it to our time and place. It requires immense hermeneutical activity to get from here to there. And I think Zionism, contemporary Zionism, wants to pretend that you can simply transport this from here to there, and I think that is methodologically impossible. So that I think Zionism may, as we say for the state of Israel, activate the base, but it has no credibility for anybody outside the base. And the decisions that are finally made about the Palestinians are not going to be made on the basis of ancient texts. They're going to be made on the basis of realpolitik today. And so the ancient tradition that has morphed into an ideology needs to be given its proper place, but it needs to be kept in its proper place and not permitted to occupy other territory. That's what I think. I meant occupy other territory in both ways, argumentatively and geographically.
You used a phrase, tremendous amount of hermeneutical activity between the text and any ethical considerations for today. What would be some key dimensions of that hermeneutical activity that enables you to move from what's going on in the text and any contemporary application or relevance?
Well, I think it is simply complexity that the land promise is incredibly uncomplex, and the present socio-geographical situation is hugely complex, and the complexity is not going to go away. The ancient community of Israel has morphed into a major military power. So those would be the kinds of arguments that I would want to make.
Okay.
And see, I think that we do that with all kinds of issues. If you try to reason from Leviticus 18 and 20 to the question about what shall the church do about gays and lesbians, you can't just take that text and do that. But there is, I know, and it won't work.
Well, why won't it work?
Well, it won't work because we live in a present very complex circumstance in which all the categories have shifted completely.
All of them?
Yeah. All of them. I think all of
Do you
them.
think there's biblical grounding for that sort of claim?
Yeah, I think they do it all the time.
Okay.
You know, the Geyser's argument from Deuteronomy 23 to Isaiah 56, or Jeremiah's movement from Deuteronomy 24 about you can't go back to your first husband, and then Jeremiah 3 uses that to argue about recommitting to Yahweh and all of that. I think they're all the time transposing texts.
So it's an internal biblical argument.
That's right.
That moves the conversation in one direction or another.
That's
in
right.
Changing times and places.
That's right.
Okay.
Yep.
And then, why is that so difficult to discern on the part of so many?
Well, because we all would rather have the text confirm our vested interests and our fears. And we want to stop the hermeneutical process at whatever moment it agrees with our vested interests and our fears. And we don't want the process to continue beyond that.
And how do you best help us get beyond that?
Oh, well, I don't know.
Okay.
I think one of the practical ways is to have parents reflect on how they have had to change their understanding of parenting from a 3-year-old to a 13-year-old to a 27-year-old son or daughter. You cannot be a parental fundamentalist and keep acting the way you acted. But new circumstances require you to completely redefine how you're going to be involved in that relationship.
On what grounds do you make that claim, completely redefined? Well, I like to be rooted in that original and what I understand that original to be claiming and saying.
Yeah.
And so how do you move me beyond that?
Well, I suppose you look at the terrible costs of trying to keep it that way. I read in the New York Times had an article about the empty nest, and you've seen that the rich people, when they are sending their kids away to prep school, they're now buying a house in the city where the prep school is so they can be near their children. And yesterday there was an article that said that these wonderful parents now, the dad is sending a text message every day to his daughter in college. I'll bet she loves that. You know, so you either sustain a relationship of dependence to keep your kid from growing up, or you will arrive at predictable alienation. But it will never turn out to be healthy for either party to keep parenting the way you parented then, etc., etc., etc.
Okay.
Pat?
I'm one of those systematic theologians who readily admits that you two have been major teachers in my life, from the time I was at Eden as a part of Seminex and classes with you, and years of sitting at Terry's feet in conversation. But I've been disturbed. And it's a question I've wanted to ask both of you for, at least 20 years, maybe 25. But it's genuinely one of deep respect. But it will be, as I think once Walt said to me, you ask mean questions. I've listened to the two of you go back and forth on sovereignty and agency. 25 years anyway. And have been instructed and totally engaged. Very important question. But I'm a student of Paul Ricoeur, and he taught me that there were three kinds of moments in a hermeneutic. A hermeneutic of goodwill, a hermeneutic of suspicion. The two of you do that very, very well. It's in the third that I fear you don't follow his advice. And that's the hermeneutics of self-doubt. Now, he doesn't mean by that be humble. He means by that there probably isn't a self. That this thing which we in the enlightened West came to agree upon, that there's somehow a self, and that its will and action is clear and distinct, out of Descartes, etc., probably doesn't exist. And so for most of your conversation about sovereignty and will and God and creation, you seem to not have enough self-doubt. I'd even wonder, maybe God doesn't have the self that we think exists. Maybe part of the wisdom of the Trinitarian God is that there isn't a single will. There isn't a single agency. I'm wondering how you've thought about those questions, about just whether or not the assumption of the modern self might need to be brought into question from your own reading of Scripture.
What scholar was he referring to? Who did he name?
I'm not certain.
Who did you name that?
Paul Ricoeur.
Ricoeur, I got it. Yeah, I thought that, but I wasn't sure.
Who I think you were the first person to mention him to me as a student, and so then I went to work with him, in part upon your recommendation.
You want to answer this one now?
Well, you didn't mention Ricoeur's hermeneutics of retrieval.
Right, but retrieval would be under goodwill. I mean, it depends on how you create the hierarchy of his.
Well, except the retrieval is after suspicion.
Right.
Well, I can assure you that I am filled with self-doubt, and more so every time I'm with Terry.
Yeah.
So
It's mutual, you understand.
Yeah, but see, I'm not talking about, Ricoeur isn't talking about self-doubt as humility or doubting myself. He's talking about doubting there is a self. You understand?
Yeah, I do. Of course I do. But
And so this whole conversation about, God's will or our will or agency is, I think, considerably more complex than it seems the way you seem to tip one way or the other over these 25 years. Now, I admit, I tend towards Terry's read. Maybe because he is next door, but I was persuaded by his reading of Scripture. But the problem are the assumptions within which you're working around what counts as a self that acts.
okay, let me see if this is a response. If one opts for the biblical narrative, one gets a God, and one gets a self, and one gets a neighbor. None of these are in doubt in this narrative. Now, Descartes' narrative would say that all differently, but in this narrative.
Right.
Now, I want to say two things about that. The first one is that my professional obligation, as I understand it, is to exposit that narrative.
Right.
And I don't have much energy for stuff outside that narrative. But the second thing is that as much as I am gifted to trust that narrative, I trust that narrative and have put my buckets down in it. And that narrative does not invite me to those kinds of doubts. Now, you may want to say that's pretty naive, but I would say that's the second naivete. Come back at that if you want.
Well, I think the Scriptures call me to that. I would interpret texts that the narrative of God that I read in the Scriptures has wills even within God that are struggling with one another.
Well, I laid that out last night, in which I talked about the internal conflictedness of God.
Right.
How can God be God and be internally conflicted?
That's a mystery of God.
Okay. But begin the conversation.
But all I'm saying is that prima facie, I would disagree with you saying that Scripture insists that I have a particular understanding of self. I think it's amazing how much diversity there is in the anthropology that Scripture offers and the many different ways in which self might be understood.
Right.
And most of the fight over agency in the modern period assumes things about a self that I'm not sure Scripture would grant me. So maybe we'd go to particular texts. I'd be happy to do that. But that's the level I would respond to you on. I'm not trying to bring something from the outside any more in than you are, although they're all there, and part of my job is to pay attention to them.
Yeah. Well, I was attempting to exposit those issues last night as best I could.
Yeah. In terms of the internal conflict of God.
Right.
Thanks.
Not quite as deep. A bulk of my congregational ministry is with the recovery community, and I want to thank both of you because apart from the big book for AA and the Bible, we come to what you write most often, and people are who have not been in the church for a long time are grateful for the way that you wonder and wrestle, and I wish so many of them could have been here today. And speaking of wrestling, something I've wanted to ask you both for 10 years, and I never thought I'd get the chance to. I have always wondered who would win arm wrestling. And if you're not up for that challenge, maybe 2 out of 3 rock, paper, scissors.
I'm not quite certain, but
We didn't hear the last.
Yeah.
We didn't hear the last.
Oh, if you're not up for arm wrestling, maybe 2 out of 3 rock, paper, scissors.
2 out of 3 what?
Please join me in thanking Walt and Karen.
Hey.